When you think of science fiction, you might think of the groundbreaking franchise of Star Wars, or the extremely exaggerated muscular body of Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator. Perhaps you're even a Trekkie, and you think of the wondrous exploration of galaxies in Star Trek. Or you think of whatever Fifth Element was doing.
Pop it, D-Man!
Hi.
Unbelievable!
However, bringing it back to the beginning, science fiction didn't get its start in film or TV. The ideas of the genre originated around the time of the Copernican Revolution. Interplanetary tales, nonlinear time, and challenging politics were base ideologies of the time that then followed into the Industrial Revolution, where the fears of spirituality were being transferred to the fears of science. The imperialistic 18 and early 1900s saw the birth of groundbreaking science fiction tales from Mary Shelley, H.G. Wells, and Jules Verne, who ended up inspiring one of the first films ever, the French science fiction film A Trip to the Moon. Let's jump forward a bit to the 1950s, the golden age of science fiction. Science fiction is moving past the novels and pulps that jump-started the love of the genre and started moving heavily into film. Like most genres at the time, 1950 science fiction was inspired by wartime fears and propaganda, specifically the Red Scare. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a prime example of this. A foreign entity, the Other, comes into quiet suburban America. These pod people take on the shape of everyone, even their neighbors, and removes all sense of emotion. No happiness, no love. It's simply the better way to live.
If a person does all these things over a period of time, he must be a communist.
The Red Scare was all over America, which fits the theme of Americans being afraid of the invading other. Communists could infiltrate their way of life, their perfect, traditional, Christian, capitalist American way of life. Clearly people were scared of this infectious other and manipulated it into an alien body. As you can see in The Thing from Another World, The Day the Earth Stood Still, It Came from Outer Space, War of the Worlds, and plenty other major films at the time. The 1960s brought many new innovations and movements in America, but most notably for science fiction, the space race. The 60s saw the push for space exploration in our real political life, but also in the lives of our fictional characters. One of the more notable films is Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, a breathtakingly beautiful and extremely influential film. Kubrick set out to make the proverbial good science fiction movie, which many film critics agreed that the film was the best of all time. 2001 showcased humans' interest in space exploration, all while expressing their anxieties about technology that they were rapidly evolving, as well as probably 100 other underlying themes, knowing how Stanley Kubrick can be. Another key moment in science fiction history was moving to the small screen with the debut of Star Trek in 1966. Star Trek was notable for many reasons. Its launch created a cult fan following, changing the way we act towards media. Trekkies took the universe Star Trek created and extended it to ways they saw fit, creating fan art, conventions, and countless amounts of lore and fan fiction literature and films. Star Trek, though, reflected some not-so-favorable traits from their American environment. Star Trek and other science fiction films based around exploration tap into the American dreams of westward expansion, Manifest Destiny. This show was literally pitched as Wagon Train to the Stars, along with JFK's famous declaration of space being the new frontier.
What was once the furthest outpost on the old frontier of the West will be the furthest outpost on the new frontier of science and space.
And overall, the general imperialistic nature of first world countries. However, Star Trek stayed relevant not only because of its wide range of issues, but because they focused on character and environment development, and not their special effects. The show featured thought-provoking subject matter as well as a fresh, optimistic outlook, all while taking influence from the xenophobic environment that spread from the Cold War and America's history of imperialism. The 70s and 80s introduced blockbuster films like Terminator, RoboCop, and Star Wars. These films tended to be linear plot-driven, violent, motion-heavy, fast-paced, relying on special effects, and to overall be amazing for the viewing experience. This makes sense as to why science fiction gained popularity. It contains those extreme, visually interesting special effects and visions of grandeur that mass audiences craved at the time. These films seem to focus on the ideas of paranoia about American masculinity. Star Wars, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and Terminator all include the lack of a father figure, challenging the previous American ideas of the perfect patriarchal nuclear family. The other side to the 1980s science fiction landscape is the relationship between man and machine, often blending the two in a violent context into the newly popularized cyborg film. Filmmakers took inspiration from the popular comics at the time, which showed men as extremely muscular figures to be admired, and blended that figure with militaristic armor. The masculine traits displayed were exemplified with exaggerated bodies and violent, intense actions every chance they were given. RoboCop touches on these subjects heavily, the fact that man and machine are one, and ultimately poses the question, what does it mean to be a man? Are there still emotions, capability to care, to nurture, and to love, all under that both literal and figurative cold steel armor encasing the natural body? The 90s continued this love of cyber and all things digital with the introduction of the internet. See The Matrix, and that about sums that all up. More recently, from the 2000s until about now, 2018, dystopic worlds and post-apocalyptic events seem to be some of the most popular themes. There are also themes of colonialism that are brought back into one of the most successful movies of all time, James Cameron's Avatar, expressing the dangers of imperialistic nations, along with some interesting, intimate imagery. The 100, The Road, Snowpiercer, Children of Men, and other films like this reflect our attitudes towards how we think our future will turn out. America recognizes that we're treating our world terribly, and naturally, in the most American fashion, we capitalize off of it. Science fiction dystopia has reached children with movies like WALL-E, then turns it on its head with Hunger Games, Divergent, and The Maze Runner, showing kids that eventually, you'll just have to kill other kids in order to overthrow the terrible future old people have made for you. That's fair, right? As you can tell, science fiction is a diverse genre. It's truly the mix of fantasy and reality. There's humor, horror, romance, action, even superhero movies and children's films. The genre succeeds and varies in multiple mediums. Pulps, comics, literature, film, TV, and video games all equally stand out as successful vehicles for the genre. Despite the variety of genres and mediums that science fiction comes through, they all are unified through certain highlights carried throughout the genre. Highlights such as a futuristic world, perhaps a utopian or dystopian society, advancements in technology, often integral to the futuristic human's daily life, exploration to various potentially unknown settlements in the galaxy with the use of some form of space-traveling vessel, most often a spaceship, occasionally a flying 1960s British police box, scientific development of biological changes to humans or animals, and encountering the other, most likely depicted as an alien life form. The conflicts that arise around these characteristics often comes from the consequences of the human race's interactions or relationship with these elements. These elements are featured in many ways, but some films highlight more characteristics than others, creating different subgenres. Subgenres vary from post-apocalyptic, science fiction horror, Western science fiction, and Afrofuturism, just to name a few, all that are distinctly unique yet unified under the wide umbrella of science fiction. Looking at science fiction through feminist theory allows us to notice the highlights within the genre that involve the threats of and against the female body. Misogyny within films isn't a new trend, it's happened in film, science fiction film, for decades, expressed in movies such as Metropolis in 1926, Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1956, Blade Runner in 1982, and countless others, all that oppress the female form. The female body has always been a key point in navigating the patriarchy, whether it be the manipulation of it or the self-control that women attempt to achieve. The idea of women taking control of their bodies has been an American fear reflected in science fiction film. In 1979, Ridley Scott debuted Alien, a film that would revolutionize science fiction and women's roles in the genre. Ripley, played by the legendary Sigourney Weaver, eradicates previous standards of women in science fiction by maintaining her femininity, all while fully kicking ass. Ripley is the sole hero of the film, doing what women everywhere want to do, take control of the phallic and invasive creatures that plague their personal space. Alongside the literal objectification and patronization that is shown to Ripley and the other female members of the crew, the film is full of imagery that represents the sexual assault environment in which women have been forced to endure. The Alien movies visualize the two things so many men look upon with disgust and horror: getting penetrated themselves and watching a woman give birth. Science fiction often relies on the female form to carry out one purpose: to be used by men. While the subjugation of the female form for pleasure is a common thread, science fiction utilizes women mostly to act as receptacles for reproduction. Children of Men, The Handmaid's Tale, The Terminator, and Mad Max Fury Road all reflect that. In Mad Max, Furiosa, a more recent badass leading lady, leads a group of imprisoned women who are solely used for their reproductive organs to freedom, chasing a landscape that hasn't been destroyed by men, taking back their autonomy through the exclamation, "We are not things," after being labeled as property. Science fiction has stepped up their female representation even more within the last 5 years with Annihilation, Arrival, Ex Machina, Under the Skin, and Gravity. Even the world-famous, mostly male fanbase of the franchise of Star Wars released their newest installments with the female lead. These films place women in powerful positions, taking charge in a patriarchal society, something that women attempt to do in the real, non-science fiction world. Margaret Atwood wrote The Handmaid's Tale in 1985, with the most recent adaptation being a television show, releasing its second season in April of 2018. Both the show and the novel focus on the newly formed Gilead, a new totalitarian and theonomic America where women are enslaved in multiple aspects of society. The show has flashbacks to America before the future's second Civil War, and the protagonist often reflects that we were all asleep. That's how it happened. The novel was inspired by the social and political climate of the time, and the recent adaptation holds just as strong, if not stronger, of a reflection of the contextual environment. The Handmaid's Tale has such a strong parallel that its imagery follows through to current American government, where women dress in the red robes of the handmaids and protest the government's attempts to remove women's sovereignty over themselves. In science fiction, like any genre, is a product of the cultural environment in which it's created. American anxieties are reflected through the history of science fiction, each decade highlighting certain principal fears of the time. Genre contains cycles of themes and characteristics, and that rightfully applies to the science fiction genre. The fears of the invading other matches America's history with xenophobia and internal racism and sexism. This cycles from the 50s until now, cycling the heaviest around post-war periods. America is a strongly nationalistic and misogynistic country, and it's natural that seeps into our media. Science fiction acknowledges our attitudes towards these actions, and while in early science fiction we embrace that, recent media attempts to show that these terrible crimes are being committed by those in power, but there's always an underlying revolution trying to stop it. Whether that's successful or not is what's undecided. Will we move towards a dystopia or a utopia? We see what we're doing to the planet, whether it be the people who reside on it or the actual planet itself. Films like WALL-E, while being a children's film, show the possibilities of a future founded upon neglect, and that future doesn't seem too far-fetched. We've also brought our fears of technology essentially upon ourselves. Technology and scientific exploration have increased more than ever within the last few decades, much to our own involvement, and we're scared that what we've created will turn on us. These modern fears cycle back from the 60s, where we were being introduced from advancements that seem to propel us into the future. Most American fears, no matter when in time, can be summed up as the fear of losing control, whether it be losing the patriarchy or losing dominance over technology. There are already news articles and your uncle's Facebook rants about how robots will be taking over our jobs, whether it be from the fast food industry or the sex industry. Eventually this will become the norm, and America will take pride in being the inhumane masters over something we deem lesser than us. Again, despite these anxieties and our not-so-favorable actions in history being what looks to be so obviously reflected into our media, the impact on society has been growing immensely, whether it be through a social fandom connection or the marketing and capitalization of pop culture merchandise. Sci-fi films and shows create such a niche programming that devoted audiences flock for each new installment. Both Star Trek and Star Wars have created massive fan bases, and these fans create their own worlds within the universe of these narratives. Perhaps we like to avoid our real-life issues by pretending we're a Jedi in training. We channel our revolution through pop culture memes, in hopes that we can ground our arguments and show that this seemingly insane, wildly futuristic dystopia will actually happen if we don't do something about it. Science fiction remains one of the most diverse and complex genres. The blending of different themes and characteristics makes science fiction instantly recognizable and distinctly unique. Americans love our good science fiction films and television shows, but do we love the messages they're reflecting back at us? Will we ever learn our lesson from our fictitious future in order to change our present reality? Or will we remain in our ignorant bliss, donning our Starfleet uniforms with a lightsaber in one hand and a sonic screwdriver in the other, angering every internet forum for not properly being a real fan of science fiction? We'll just have to see where our space vessels take us.